right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jackie Otting. I am the co-event coordinator for the Supporting Students with Disabilities intersection for TESOL. We're super excited about this webinar today, so thank you so much for all being here. We just want to make sure that everybody knows about our intersection and that you're all welcome to join if you're a member of TESOL. We obviously host these webinars. We have some other things, coffee chats and things like that. Our chair is on the call. Carrie is here, Carrie Torres. So good to see you. And I'm really excited about this. I said that already, but I am just so excited. So it's going to be great. I'll let our presenters introduce themselves and I will step away. So thank you, everyone. I am an elementary school teacher, so I'm going to turn my camera off in case a kid kind of runs in or says hello or something. So, all right. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening. We're really excited to be presenting on Individualized Language Plans, or ILPs, their promises and pitfalls. I'm Dr. Sarah Kangas, and I'm here with my colleague.
Hi, I'm Maria Choi Pena. I'm an assistant professor at Penn's Graduate School of Education. And since Sarah said good evening, I'll say good morning to those of you who are here today.
Yes, thank you. So we're going to dive into our webinar today. We're hoping to have a little bit of time of interaction with you all, as you'll see. But this particular presentation is based on our evaluation of ILP templates that are commonly used across the US. So we did an evaluation of 12 different types of ILPs that are mandated in various states. And this is the basis of this presentation, just to provide some context for you. So we're hoping to provide a bit more background on the use of these plans, what we identify as pitfalls or limitations, and then pivot into how these plans could be modified to really live up to their promise of supporting multilingual or ML students. And then we hope to round out with an open discussion where we talk a little bit together with you about your experiences using these plans or your perceptions of these plans. So one thing that we're hoping to do as we kick off is to understand a little bit more about you. I'm going to share a link to the Jamboard in the chat. And what we're hoping is that you could first help us know a little bit more about you, post about your name, your role. Oh, I see that is coming through. So the chat here I'm posting for you. On the first frame, we're asking you to indicate your name, your role, and your location. And then on the second frame or slide, we're asking you to address the two questions listed there, which are, what if anything do you know about individualized language plans, and what curiosities do you have about these documents? So we're going to give you a little bit of time to first, on the first frame or slide, post your name, your location, and role, and then on the second frame, using the link provided in the chat, what, if anything, do you know about ILPs, and what curiosities do you have about these documents? And this will help guide our time together. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that.
Hi, Sarah. For me, it is view only.
It's updated.
For me, it's the
Okay,
same.
perfect. Thank you so much.
If you refresh, you'll be able to edit now.
Awesome. Thank you.
And then once you've shared your name, your role, and your location, you can move on to the second slide and add what, if anything, you know about ILPs and or what curiosities do you have about them.
Sorry, can you repeat the question again, please? I couldn't hear it.
Oh, sure. Just that once you're done with the first Jamboard where you share your name, your role, and your location, you can move on to the second one, and the two questions are posted there. So the first question is, what, if anything, do you know about individual learning plans? And what curiosities do you have about individual learner plans?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Kari, we have a question in the chat if the recording will be available later. Oh, awesome. Thanks.
Yes, it will. It generally takes a few days to process, and then it's uploaded to TESOL's YouTube channel, and then we'll send out the link.
I think we'll give one more minute for folks to respond on the second frame or slide. Okay, so I'm seeing just quite a bit of comments from folks who've been using them for several years to those who are just kind of curious about the plans, have never really encountered themselves, have read about them, and are curious about their uses. So we see a lot of interesting questions about how to form goals, how they may intersect with IEPs and the goals in IEPs. This will give us a lot to think about as we proceed throughout the rest of the presentation. So we're going to come back to these in the upcoming moments. So thanks for sharing these experiences with us, and thanks for sharing a little bit about yourself. So just to kind of pivot into the background of these documents, we're referring to them as individualized language plans, but they go by many names. So English learner plans, language acquisition programs, language services plans, and all of these documents really center on the students' learning and goals, but with a sustained focus on language. These documents are gaining traction across the US, and more than 25% of the US states require ILPs in some capacity. And in addition to that, we have a lot of districts that are initiating more of a grassroots effort to implement these documents on their own in an effort to improve services supports. And I saw one of the comments in the Jamboard spoke to that, wanting to improve the more tailored supports for students, and this being a pathway to do that. So if you're familiar with these documents at all, even the names suggest that they may be similar to the individualized education programs that we may encounter in special education that have been used to guide student learning in light of the disability that they may have. And so in addition to focusing on student learning and goals, these documents can be useful tools for teachers. If they have an instructional focus, it should help guide teachers at how to best support the student and their language, in their particular language needs and goals, but also foster collaboration. I saw comments relating to teams and how can we work with teams together to support these students. So this document can provide kind of a baseline understanding for the teachers on the teams to work together to support the students' language proficiency.
You'd think 3 years in, I wouldn't still be muted. Thanks so much, Sarah. So I want to talk a little bit about the uses of individual learner plans and kind of the structures that we have noticed. So it's important to recognize that in some districts, the adoption of these plans is in essence a grassroots effort initiated by multilingual school teachers and leaders who are really interested in improving multilingual services and support. So we want to recognize the origins of this is really rooted in a desire to support learners as we start looking at what are the implications and what is the tangible impact of these plans. So first, we start to see the use of IEPs being implemented in some places for all multilingual learners, but in other sites, they focus primarily on multilingual learners who have not made adequate English language proficiency gains, right? So we typically think of these students as multilingual learners who are long-term English learners, right? That might be a common phrase that we hear, or multilingual learners with disabilities or multilingual learners with interrupted formal schooling. Along those same lines, we started looking at 13 states that mandated ILPs. 12 of those 13 states required or had a recommended template provided to districts. And that's really where our review is rooted, is in these 12 templates that existed. Specifically, we located the most updated publicly available versions of these templates from each of the states' respective websites and policy guidance documents. And we noticed that there's great variability across states and districts in their formats. One reason for this is that there's no real federal oversight, since again, this is originating from local communities and districts. And the second thing is that many ILPs have some of the same components as individual education plans. So across our review of these templates, we found that the majority included the following components. So first, the current English language proficiency performance. Then we have current academic performance, the annual goals, right, which is very similar to annual individual education program or plan goals, language services to be provided, assessment accommodations, and instructional accommodations. And so the table that you see before you really summarizes the components featured in ILPs, while this next table specifies the frequency of these components across the 12 ILP templates that we reviewed. And we see here that there was a high reliance on assessment outcomes and grades and fewer inclusion of parental input or even consent. So given that like really quick overview that we've just provided, and also the familiarity that some of you already have with these plans, we'd like to invite you to return to the Jamboard. And on the third frame, we'd like you to share, sorry, for some reason I went to 4. We'd like you to think of what's one promising aspect of individual language plans, and what is one potential danger that we could encounter across these plans. And so we'll offer, I'm going to share it up here, and we'll take about 3 minutes. Or 2 minutes.
And if anyone came late, I just reposted the Jamboard link so you can have access to that.
Thank you, Sarah. Great. So there's some really fruitful things here. So in terms of promises, we're seeing ideas around what can be supportive for students' individual needs, right? Offering support to educators and teachers of multilingual learners. We can see that it can support instructional development, building individualized language supports for learners, accommodations, providing a centralized place for guidance on supporting learners, having continuity of understanding of a learner's needs and their progression. And then on the dangers, we've highlighted, oh, sorry for the visuals. I've got like 3 monitors going on. It's very fancy. And so in terms of the dangers, we're noticing issues like it's the potential to be labor intensive, right? That it adds more workload to educators. So again, the potential to become a compliance tool, right? Rather than a tool that will actually facilitate any really clear learning, potentially not utilized by all teachers, right? That come in contact with that learner. And so with that in mind, we'd like to turn and kind of talk to you about what we've noticed or kind of surfaced as some emerging promises and pitfalls from our analysis of these reviews to date.
Okay, so let me reshare my screen as we come back into the slides. And I love the ideas that you shared because I think they are touching upon some of what Maria and I have been exploring in our work together. So one of the things that stood out to us the most in reviewing these ILPs is that the documents really center standardized English language proficiency scores in a way that kind of eclipses instructional support to students, as well as other types of very important data that tell us how the student is performing. And some recent research by Thompson and colleagues has alluded to this same type of dilemma, that the documents are focusing so much on test scores that they're not really living up to being a plan. They're really more focusing on cataloging scores over time. And so this is just an example of one of the templates that we examined, where the template itself had 7 steps or 7 components, and 4 of those components focused on scores alone. So how is the student in this case performing on the WIDA access over the last several years? How are we hoping they perform in the future? And what are their scores on these different other types of standardized assessments? So the document really became a way of tracking performance over time instead of instructional planning. And in fact, in our review of the different plans themselves, as well as guidance, one of the particular states positions the document as a way to monitor ELP scores. So it's not really an instructional tool that can help teachers drive their instruction, but more so kind of keeping track of the scores, seeing, are they making progress? And if not, why not? But not really providing much for teachers to work with in terms of instructional support. Maria, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. And so that really brings us back to this idea of what is the purpose of these plans, right? And reminding ourselves that, like you all suggested on the Jamboard, they were in some ways surfaced in order to support learners and to support teachers, right? And one thing that I kind of want to highlight for us is that in recent years, we as second language educators and as the fields that work with multilingual learners have really shifted the terminology that we use to refer to linguistically diverse students. We prefer the terms emergent bilingual or multilingual learner to the more reductionist or deficit-oriented title of like English language learner, right? Or to that classification. And we do this in an effort to recognize the many gifts and talents that students bring. However, changes in terminology can only go so far if we continue to rely on measures that position students in relation to what they need without accounting for what they have, for what they can do, right? And that's something that we're really concerned about in the focus on, again, a standardized assessment test scores, and in particular, the focus and rooting of English rather than anything else. And so what we want to be thinking about is these statistical figures that currently exist, right? So we know that racialized students are overrepresented in special education and in English learner programs. We also know that students at the intersection of linguistic and body-mind diversity, right? So students who may or may not be identified as having a disability formally in school are more often served in segregated educational settings, right? And so a great deal of research tells us that bias in testing measures and or evaluation or in the evaluators themselves results in placement in settings that lack rich curriculum, that are often focused on remediation, right, which results in decreased opportunities to learn for multiply marginalized learners. And so we really want to consider how our reliance of standardized assessment in individual language plans can further marginalize, racialize, and pathologize essentially learners, right? Of particular concern to us is how ILPs can be used to legitimize the increased, right, yet erroneous participation of multilingual learners in special education. Currently, these students are overrepresented in subjective disability categories like specific learning disability and a particular note, speech and language impairment. So ILPs really have the potential to pathologize or further codify the ways that we negatively think about linguistic differences, ultimately creating and supporting a new special education pipeline that's rooted primarily in the devaluation of multilingual learners' diverse linguistic practices rather than the existence of an actual impairment, right? And that's something that we really want to be thinking about as we look at these plans and as we enact them in schools.
One of kind of an extension of what Maria shared is the concern that by foregrounding ELP data, standardized ELP data alone, and emitting ecological data, so data that looks at the quality of the learning environment or the quality or the student's response to the learning environment, by omitting those types of data, it's going to further exacerbate other types of segregated placements that we know our English learner, multilingual learner students encounter. So segregated language programs or lower track courses. So there's documented evidence across the literature that ML students have this disadvantageous placement in programs based on these high stakes assessment scores, and with the documents focusing on them to such a large extent while omitting other types of very valuable data, that this trend could be further exacerbated. In particular, in looking at the plans, we see here that there are spaces, and many of them included areas to describe the services or recommended services for the student. And again, if the only data kind of featured in these plans focuses so much on the student's performance on the annual, standardized assessment or alternate version of that assessment, the concern is, what abilities are we missing out on, and may this result in their placement into more self-contained classrooms in language programs and special education programs, as Maria shared with us just a few minutes ago.
I want to add to that, it also further distances students from rich curriculum, right? Because then we're not thinking about these things as services that should travel with the child, but rather as services that remove the child from, the general education classroom and that curriculum access. So thank you, Sarah. Having said that, we want to, move back from thinking about the pitfalls to thinking about the promises, and what are the things that we can do to really make these transformative pieces, right, or transformative resources, rather than just, again, another kind of box or list of things that we can check off. So the first thing that we think about is when we're thinking about the ways that you all identified in the Jamboard, right, around what are the promises, it's around being able to support teachers and being able to support students. And so we believe that one of the ways that we could really fulfill that promise is by emphasizing instructional practices. Rather than just thinking about the placement of the student, or by looking again on test course performance, it's what kind of instructional practices are these learners being exposed to? What kind of instructional practices do they need or could they benefit from moving forward? So, we want to be thinking about including components dedicated to instructional practices, right? So making sure that the instructional practice is aligned to individual student needs, goal, and instruction, right? Rather than just what is available to the teacher. One thing that I can say honestly is that when I was a special education classroom teacher, I would often choose self-contained or the 12-to-1 or the existing placement of that learner as the setting for the next year without really considering the other program options, right? And how do we make sure that we're not building that also into the way that we use these plans, right? That teachers aren't just checking off, okay, this is the next program that's right for them, but really having the time to sit down and think about this without it being added labor. So we want to be moving away from things like just extended time, preferred seating, visual and graphic organizations, because that doesn't really change the instructional or educational experience of the learner. And so we want to point towards things that we've already been using and thinking about, right? So we want to think about translanguaging, right? What are the ways that translanguaging can be included in a lot of these programs and settings so that learners can be using their existing linguistic repertoire, right, while others developing and adding new features to their repertoire. We want to be thinking about the ways that language goals are being developed to really match curricula. Thank you. And then, sorry. We also want to draw on best practices that already exist, right? We want to think about direct English instruction, primary language support, scaffolded content area instruction, and not only be constrained, right, to English only instructional supports, right? And thinking about what are the ways that we can really create linguistically rich learning experiences for our students.
In terms of our second primary recommendation, so kind of centering instruction and making sure that instruction accounts for students by multilingualism and moves away from generic accommodations, it stuck out to us that in focusing so much on ELP scores, that there really needs to be a multiplicity of data that are added into the plan. And in addition, a multiplicity of voices. So in terms of data, helping teachers revise plans or modifying existing state plans. I saw that in one of the comments, like you can do more than what just exists in the template that's given you. And so in an effort to do that, integrating data that gives us a bit of a portrait of the students by multilingualism and how they're performing on classrooms assessments, their course grades, observations of the students' performance and engagement, as well as the student and family reports of language practices and abilities. So having a more holistic sense of the student instead of just the score kind of defining who they are and defining their learning opportunities. And so, and for us, our important consideration is to how can we account for the students by multilingualism, the assets and capabilities that they bring to learning, and what type of data help us do that instead of just cataloging the scores. So here we thought is an example that kind of moves us in that right direction. One of the plans asking our teachers to provide a language portrait. So where teachers can know more about the students' language practices in and out of school, in and out of their community, what types of media they're engaging with and in what languages, to help understand who is this student and what is their language practices and what are their capabilities in a more holistic sense. In addition, you may recall that Maria showed a table that showed us how parent feedback or parent input was a limited feature of many of the plans. So half of them didn't even include parent feedback. So for us, we think this is such a pivotal recommendation, is moving away from just it being a school document to something that parents and students can engage in. I saw on the Jamboard that there was a comment that there might be a perception this is just something ELD teachers do. And in looking at some of the plans, there were some plans that just solicited the signature of an ELD teacher or the building principal, and it wasn't really a multi kind of stakeholder endeavor where specialists are coming together, providing perspectives and input on the document. So we would advocate for more of that multi-stakeholder input and having input from parents. And so this is just a small example of one particular plan that every quarter they prompted for teacher feedback, but as well as parent and guardian input. We also think it's really important to start thinking about how students themselves are involved in the process in special education. You want students with disabilities to be empowered, to have agency and be a part of their IEP teams and their plans. And so we would advocate similarly for our ML students. What goals do they have for their language development? What is important for them, and what type of feedback do they have in this process? So especially for those secondary MLs, having them become more a part of the process and have a voice and agency in their own education, we think is just such an important implication for revamping and refining some of these plans.
Thanks, Sarah. And so we know that that's been a lot of information in a really small amount of time. But we're curious now, and we want to return back to our Jamboard and think about, what have you learned as a result of this session, or what do you plan to do as a result of this session? So this might be like, what's a question that's piquing that you want to investigate, or who's a person in your building that you want to have a conversation with about these plans? Maybe it's reviewing plans. So just, what do you think are like your next steps? Or what is the thing that has resonated for you so far? And we'll take 3 minutes for that as well. I will share. I'm going in and doing a little clustering of similar thoughts. So we'll do 1 more minute. So far, I feel like I can organize kind of, there's 3 threads that are surfacing for me around what are the next steps or the things that we want to be thinking about. So in the first, we're really noticing people are really thinking about how can they return to these plans, right? And be more conscientious in engaging with them, right? So how can I look at accommodations differently and make them more specific? How can I think about the student-specific supports and scaffolds that are needed, right? How can I think about placement decisions that are being made for dually identified students, right? And this is really what we want teachers to kind of bring to these documents. It's this criticality and this reflection of how do I make this better, right? And how do I actually make this a tool that fulfills its promise, right? Rather than something that further contributes to the alienation of and exclusion of my learners, whom we so deeply care about, right? I think the second category that I'm noticing is involving other stakeholders, right? And other people in these conversations, right? So having more informed decisions with our colleagues, but also including students and parental voice. What I want to make sure that we are thinking about when we're including parent voice, right, is that is a feature of individual education plans, right, of IEPs, but often this also becomes another box to tick off, right? It's just, we ask the parents what, if they're happy or not happy, what they want or don't want, and not really an engagement on a meaningful conversation of what are your long-term goals for your child, academically, linguistically, socially, and thinking about how these plans can inform, right, and work alongside those same goals. And then the third kind of strand that I'm noticing is people want to know more, right? So doing more research, sharing these with students and exploring what are the ways that we can use these in affirming ways. Thinking about how can states use them and integrate them when they're not required to, right? So how can we use this as a beneficial supplementary tool? And so we're really excited. I'm really excited to see these kinds of thoughts and ideas surface, because this is essentially what Sarah and I were hoping for. It's just an engagement with these tools and to really bring them to your attention and get you thinking about what questions should I be asking, and where should I be looking further. I'm going to stop sharing now, Sarah.
We're going to now kind of come back to our slides, and we're hoping to talk a little bit more with you, especially with some of the ideas raised, and really open it up for discussion. We have a small enough group, I think, that we can, unmute if you feel comfortable, or if you don't feel comfortable putting it in the chat. But we'd love to hear a few thoughts on what lingering questions you have about ILPs and ILP teams, and then we can turn to the second question when we've covered that. I did see an important question in the Jamboard about, like, how do we collect that holistic data while not, kind of falling into this huge time sink. So maybe that's something we can explore as a group, and I'd love to hear thoughts and have it be an open discussion with you all sharing your experiences, and not just, Maria and I responding. I am seeing a question that's a little bit more like logistical. Where can we learn about the ILPs that you reviewed? We can certainly provide like follow-up materials to you about the plans that we looked at, if that's helpful. We collected those, so even just having those plans might be useful for you for thinking about ideas, and we can definitely follow up with that. I saw that question from Nancy. So we can definitely provide that following our talk today.
I think the only other thing that I want to mention that we didn't get to share during the talk is that while these plans are modeled or follow similar or in the same kind of inspirational stance as IEPs, IEPs have a lot of legal support, right, and financial support that comes with them because of their relationship and their placement in relation to IDEA. So so when we're thinking about these plans and adopting those plans, we also need to be conscious of how we can be taking on additional work without necessarily, or be asked to do so without necessarily being provided with additional infrastructure to be able to do that work successfully, right? So I think when teachers are also looking at these plans, it's important to think about what supports do I need in order to make these be effective and successful pieces of successful materials. Sarah, have we shared our findings with the institutions we collected the data from?
No, we haven't. Maria and I just really finished this like evaluation of the plans, and we have that work currently under review. But we can definitely share with you all the states that we looked at, the templates, if that's of interest to the group. And then I see a recommended article that the group might want to look at in the JustBar journal that recently came out. This might be the one that I referenced earlier with Karen Thompson's work, recent work on looking at ILP team collaborations. So thanks for sharing that. So I guess we want to return to lingering questions you have about ILPs and ILP teams, and feel free to share out loud with us or put in the chat.
Look, we're amazing. Everyone's like, all of our questions are answered.
I think it might be important to talk about the time-consuming nature. I'm curious if the group has any thoughts, like how do you collect some of that data or make use of the data that's already collected to provide more of that holistic understanding of a student. Well, one of the common pitfalls that was listed at least more than once is that time-consuming nature. And I'm curious if anyone in the group has any recommendations or thoughts on that, how you balance those. So the score, like focusing on the score is less time consuming, right? It's more easily accessible, but these other types of data may take time to collect. So any thoughts from participants about your experiences with collecting other types of data?
Hello. I'm sorry, but so can you just share a little bit more? So you added in the chat, Michelle Regalo and I have been working with special needs students and typically developing students in our dual language immersion program since 2014. And IOP sounds similar to what we have been doing. Can you share a little bit of what you mean in terms of that sounds similar and the relationship to what you've been doing in your class?
Yes, can you hear me?
You can.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So what we've been doing is we established the language program as Flex first, but then we turned it into a dual language immersion program. And in these classrooms that we have, both the typically developing students and the students with disabilities are in the same classroom. So every student has a different need, different special needs. So we had to figure out like how we can kind of control these, still collect data, still teach students. So we started looking at their IEPs, and then we created something similar to yours, actually, more like we wanted to find out what teachers' perspective is and what the students are really doing in classroom, rather than looking at standardized scores, because our students are not standard. They have all special needs, different kinds. We started with creating classroom forms that would be parallel with the standardized testing, so that we can look at the same things like productive skills, receptive skills, and then we kind of jot down ideas, created those tables, and then started using them. And then we were able to see English improvement and French improvement based on teacher comments, parent comments, and students' improvement in 4 quarters within 1 year. But it's all, handmade forms. We published a couple of papers on that, doing statistical analyses and stuff. But it would be great to find something that like everyone can use in such schools and programs. So I'm kind of curious, like, what exactly you did. Is it completely matching with us, what you guys have and what we have? Maybe we can share later on in another conference or something, or personal communication. So this is what we did actually to kind of unstandardized but still find out student needs. Like one student has ADHD, the other student has a vision impairment, and then the other student might have something else, but they are learning in the same classroom.
So I think so I'm hearing a couple of things. One, I just want to clarify. So Sarah and I didn't develop any of these templates. We just gathered them. We gathered them and we looked at them and we tried to look at them for patterns. We tried to look at, places where they deviated from each other and just like, what could we learn about them? Because they were kind of being presented and introduced without any accompanying literature in a lot of the cases that we were noticing. But what I heard from what you were sharing were some time management supports, right? Are things like collaboration, about doing this work in partnership, a focus on skills, right? As expressed in the classroom work and not necessarily just on standardized assessment. And then finally having that communal input, right? Of having student input, of having other teachers give an opinion, of having parents give advice. What I also appreciated from what you just shared, Hilal, is, am I saying your name correctly?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Is also that one way to avoid it becoming a deficit-focused tool, right, or a remedial tool, was by implementing your resources with all of your learners, right? So recognizing that all learners are individual learners, right? That all learners have some type of need. And in some ways that, that universalizing of these documents and facilitates some of this data collection, right? Because if you understand that you're going to do this for all of your learners, then maybe you're more likely to develop in-class activities and in-class assessments that would surface some of this information in a multiplicity of ways, rather than just standardized assessments if you only have 2 or 3 learners that you're thinking about in your classroom. Right. So how are the ways in which expanding these tools could also not only negate, some of that deficit rooted perspectives, but also support teachers in being able to accomplish and gather this data, because it's needed to improve education for all learners, not just a handful.
Yes, we actually get help from the other professionals. So we have a special education person and a counselor in class. So about like 3 adults, and sometimes we have like a teacher aides because of the variety of disabilities in classroom.
Great. Yeah. So this need of collaboration and community effort.
Definitely.
Thank you. Sarah, did you hear anything else?
No, I don't see anything else. Oh, Carrie just posted in the chat. Another thought for time management is that when we center students in the curriculum and include opportunities for sharing, reflection, and personal connection, we can often learn a lot about our students without becoming additional data, that like another data collection exercise, which I really appreciate. I do see like a duplication of efforts in collecting data that's basically already been collected, and thinking a little bit more expansively about what data is. And I think Carrie's comment really alludes to that. There's already information that you're collecting that can be done a little bit more systematically, perhaps, but kind of be built into your understanding of the student's abilities.
And then Jennifer just added, I'm trying to figure out how I would balance some of the things that I've used to help me write IEPs and ILPs more quickly, yet also make it appropriate to each individual student. For example, I've used modification banks to help me think about what modifications I might provide for students. I think, I mean, Sarah, I'll turn it over to you, but I think thinking about a bank of like, what are the different instructional practices, right, that can support this learner, or the different types of language programs and settings that could benefit this learner. Yeah, Sarah?
Yeah, I think one thing that, and I'll speak for myself, Maria, you can, feel free to disagree. But I would like to see us think a little bit more, maybe use those, like what Jennifer's saying, that modification bank, but then, trying to also think about how does this relate to the student, like in specific areas of language, like reading and writing. And so I think sometimes the generic aspect of the accommodations is that it's, it could cover everything, but then again, the student is going to have specific language goals across domains of language, like listening, speaking, reading, and writing. There may be other goals. So I think those modification like banks could be great as like a starting point, but then thinking about, can we specify a little bit more towards the language domains that students have areas of need in? I don't know. What do you think, Maria?
Yeah, I agree. I think it requires a level of expertise and experience, right, in order to really use a bank of any sort in a way that's really affirming and totally, right? And I think you'll still run the risk of having issues of like what supports am I being given. But I just saw that Elizabeth added, that she also appreciates ILPs that start with what students can do. And I think if we had a combination of both what students can do and maybe like a list of all of the options for supporting students rather than just what a teacher can think of themselves, right? And maybe that's a place where state education agencies could really support in the development of these plans, is what are the instructional options that are available to these learners in this state, right? So that we're not just thinking about what's available in this class, in this school, which often what we know is what we do and what we replicate, and it's not necessarily what is needed to move forward. Majabeen, is that correct? Majabeen Hussein? Last name?
Yes, yes.
Can you tell me more about what you envision in terms of involving parents as volunteers?
Yeah, I was thinking, like you said, that when you have so much data, it becomes it may go wasted, right? So I was thinking there might be parents who are interested to contribute, and you could involve them in sorting out data, and it just crossed my mind that you could use the parents as well. They would be more than happy to. Some of them might be happy to help.
Yeah, and I think that would be a great way to get data that's beyond our reach, right? So how
Right.
are students communicating on the playground?
Yes.
How are they being, what linguistic supports are they accessing in content area, right? At the cafeteria.
Yes.
Because these are spaces, right, that are not instructionally bound, but are still linguistically taxing for students, right? And so it offers us another view into what they can do, what they want to do, right? What they're trying to do. So I think that's a great idea.
Because when you're the teacher, I think that it's only your perspective that you're looking at.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's another way of increasing that multiplicity of voices that Sarah was talking about earlier. So I'm looking at time, and so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Yeah, I don't think we have time to dive into our last question. So I want to be cognizant that we're, nearly at time, but we're happy to follow up with sharing additional resources and information that you have about. I know there's questions like what states and what did you look at? So we can definitely provide that in a follow-up. And I'm sure, Carrie, you can help me do that and reaching out to who was attending today. But if you have other questions or inquiries, feel free to reach out to Maria and I. We're happy to answer questions that you may have and share resources that we have related to this topic. So don't be shy about that. And especially, I know sometimes teachers don't have access to certain, literature. Also, we're happy to share that and kind of get you behind the firewall if there's a study that you're interested in relating to ILPs or IEPs for MLs. So I think that ends our time together. And thank you so much for attending and, participating and offering such great ideas.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. We're so happy to have you. This is great.